Good morning, Ed here from Crystal Clear Aquatics, and thank you for tuning in. Welcome to another plant marginal A to Z. Now previously I talked about the lovely marsh marigold, which is putting still a lovely display despite us moving on into May and nearly in June. Very prolific flowerer. But today I want to talk about a real classic pond plant. I think when you think of ponds, there are a couple of plants that you really think of. One of them is the water lily, the lovely floating pads on the surface. And I think the other plant that, if you were to ask anybody to describe a pond plant, they'd probably pick the water iris. A lovely architectural tall plant to put in a pond. The one in front of me here, this is Iris versicolor, or the American flag iris. And irises are a rhizomous perennial, and by that I mean they grow from a thick rhizomous root, a bit like a water lily. And from that you'll have the growing stems, the emerging foliage and the fibrous roots. And in winter time it will die back down and all its energy will go back down into that rhizome. There are sort of 3 or 4 main varieties of iris that you're going to encounter in a pond, and these are true aquatic marginal irises. There are lots of other terrestrial irises, bog irises that will tolerate damp conditions and tolerate sort of partial submersion, but not for any length of time. So I'm just going to cover the main pond marginal irises. I suppose the classic one would be the yellow flag iris, the Iris pseudochorus. That's our native yellow iris. They can get pretty large, sort of 4 feet in height, very large, thick leaves and great big flowers. They're really only suitable for very large ponds or big natural ponds. They can look a little bit out of scale in most garden ponds and can be quite thuggish and unruly and really take over. Much better for an average pond would be the purple irises. And the 2 most common ones you're going to encounter there, which are true marginals, would be the Iris versicolor, which is this one here, the American flag iris, or the purple flag iris. And these chaps get to about sort of 80 centimetres in height, so much more manageable for an average garden pond. Beautiful purple flowers. And I think the irises put on a fantastic show, but sadly it's a very, very short-lived show. The foliage is lovely, thankfully. But the flowers, you'll get a couple of weeks during the summer months when they look fantastic, and then the show's over. You can try and prolong this flowering period by deadheading and removing all of the finished flowers, but unfortunately it's not going to last very long. Another lovely purple iris you're going to encounter is Iris labiata, which is the Japanese purple iris. Doesn't grow quite as big, I don't think it's quite as easy to grow as the Iris versicolor either. But you may have seen a pond I was building, a little wildlife frog pond a few weeks ago, and that one was using the Iris labiata. And there's also a wonderful variegated version of that as well, which is one of my favourite pond plants. From that there are other sort of hybrids. The Iris pseudochorus, you can get smaller varieties of the yellow, and likewise with the purples there are other hybridizations. But those are the 3 main irises you'll encounter. Now and again you'll also encounter Iris sibirica, which will grow quite happily out of water, but will also tolerate submersion for long periods of time, down to kind of 4 inches of water, which is very similar to the Iris versicolor, again another purple. Irises are quite an adaptable plant. They'll tolerate full sunshine, and in this situation here, dappled sort of partial shade. They'll prefer full sun and they'll give you maximum flowers in a sunny position, but even in this area here they'll put on a good display and will provide plenty of flowers. Care for these sort of plants couldn't be simpler. They want to have their roots in water, so 4 to 6 inches of water above the crown, kind of maximum depth. The yellow flag iris, the pseudochorus, will tolerate greater depths, 20 to 30 centimetres, 8 inches to 12 inches of water or thereabouts. But equally they'll tolerate periods of dry as long as they've got their roots sort of touching water or very moist ground. And in fact a lot of the dedicated marginal irises will quite happily grow out of water as well, as long as they're in a damp area kept well watered. When they finish flowering, the flowering stems from the iris can become very heavy as that flower develops into quite a large heavy seed pod. And you'll notice then that they start to flop down and they'll pull the plant down with it. So to keep it nice and neat and tidy, when it's finished flowering and those flowers have closed up, unless you're deliberately trying to set some seeds from them, cut off those flower buds. And as I say, that will also help to encourage more prosperous and sort of frequent flowering. In winter time, once we get a few frosts, the foliage will start to turn yellow, as will the majority of pond marginal plants. and that's the time to give it a cut back. And I would trim all of the emerging foliage from ponds, including the irises, down to 3 or 4 inches. And that allows next year the new growth to grow through unhindered, and it will help to prevent any decaying foliage from breaking down in the pond and introducing nutrients that we want to discourage. Now, pond irises, as all other marginal plants, are very important in a pond. Aesthetically, they are probably the most obvious and visible plants that you'll see in the pond. They help to reduce nutrients, which helps to outcompete algae, blanket weed, green water. But perhaps most importantly, when you've got plants growing in the margins, it's habitat for wildlife. It's a fantastic transition from the pond edge into the pond itself, and it's really important for larvae such as dragonflies, which as their larvae emerge from the pond, they'll be crawling up and sticking to the side of an iris as they emerge into their adult form, and then they'll sit on the iris leaves as they dry their wings before they'll fly off. So very important for pond wildlife as well. So if you're in the market for adding some plants to your pond this year, or you're building a new pond, I would highly recommend irises, a wonderful family of plants, and a very important one which you must add to your pond. I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you on the next pond.